There is a question at the center of the Nolan Wells case that sounds simple but becomes much harder the deeper you look into the timeline. What happened during the hours between the last confirmed sighting of an 18-year-old college football player on Horn Island and the moment the boat carrying his friends finally left the island without him? Because this case is not built around one mysterious location that nobody can identify. We know where Nolan Wells went. We know when the boat carrying him left the Mississippi mainland. We know when it reached Horn Island. We know roughly when Nolan was last seen. We know when the boat left the island. We know that the boat later traveled back through the waterways around Ocean Springs. And we know that 2 days later, Nolan's body was found in the water near the island. But the evidence currently available to the public does not provide a complete account of everything that happened in between. And that is where the question of video becomes important. Not because anyone has established that a hidden recording contains the answer. Not because there is proof that authorities possess footage showing Nolan's final moments. And not because the existence of a camera automatically means that camera captured something useful. The reason the footage question matters is much simpler. When investigators are trying to reconstruct a person's final known movements, photographs, videos, GPS records, phone data, witness statements, dispatch recordings, and other digital evidence can sometimes help turn a fragmented timeline into a much clearer one. And in Nolan's case, authorities themselves publicly asked people who had original photographs, videos, or eyewitness information from Horn Island on July 4th to come forward. So today, we're going to follow the documented timeline carefully. We're going to separate what is known from what is alleged. We're going to look at what the boat's GPS data tells us, what the sea tow call tells us, what Nolan's family has questioned, what investigators have publicly said, and why potential surveillance along the surrounding waterways deserves attention, without turning assumptions into facts. If you value this kind of evidence-based true crime coverage, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Brian Case Records, because this case has generated an enormous amount of information online, and our job is to separate the information that can actually be checked from everything that cannot. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He was from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and he had been building a future around football, school, family, and the people he grew up with. He had attended Ocean Springs High School and later continued his football career at Southwest Mississippi Community College. In February 2025, when Nolan spoke publicly about signing with the college, he described the opportunity as a blessing and talked about continuing his football career alongside friends and teammates. His coach later remembered him as more than an athlete. He described Nolan as a son, teammate, friend, and student who worked hard, treated people with respect, and led by example. That matters because the name Nolan Wells can easily become reduced to a timeline, a boat, an island, a missing person report, a body recovered from the water. But before all of that, there was a young man with plans for the future. And on July 3, 2026, there was nothing about the evening that suggested those plans were about to end. Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, later said that July 3rd was the last time she personally heard from her son. According to her account, Nolan cooked dinner for his parents before leaving to stay at a friend's house. Before he left, he told his mother he loved her, hugged her, and kissed her goodbye. It was an ordinary family moment, the kind of moment that usually disappears into memory because nobody expects it to become important. But the next day was July 4th, and Nolan was going to Horn Island. Horn Island sits off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, roughly 10 miles south of the mainland. It is part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore and is reached by boat. For the holiday, Nolan went out with friends. The boat that carried him left a private dock in the Ocean Springs area at approximately 9:56 in the morning, according to GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, later obtained by CBS News. The same data places the vessel arriving at Horn Island at approximately 11:14 that morning. Those two times matter because they are not simply someone's recollection months later. They come from the vessel's GPS tracking information. That gives investigators something extremely valuable: a starting point, a destination, and a measurable route between them. The day itself was supposed to be a celebration. People were gathering around the island. Boats were moving through the surrounding waters. Friends were spending the holiday together, and Nolan was among them. At some point during the afternoon, however, the situation changed. According to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, Nolan was last seen around 3 p.m. People who were with him also gave investigators the same approximate time for his last known sighting. That 3 o'clock time becomes one of the most important points in the entire case, because it marks the boundary between what we can establish about Nolan's presence on the island and the increasingly incomplete account of what happened afterward. The boat carrying the group did not leave Horn Island at 3. It remained there for more than another hour, and according to GPS data obtained by CBS News, the vessel finally left Horn Island at approximately 4:31 p.m. That means there was a substantial period between Nolan's reported last sighting and the boat's departure. But a gap in a public timeline does not automatically mean a crime occurred during that gap. It means there are events we do not yet have a complete public record of. That distinction matters. There is a difference between saying, "We don't know exactly what happened," and saying, "We know what happened and someone is hiding it." The first statement is supported by the incomplete public record. The second requires evidence that has not been established. So let's stay with what can actually be documented. According to statements attributed to people who were with the group, Nolan decided to remain on the island. Warren Hudson, one of the young people connected to the trip, later said, Nolan chose to stay behind with a girl and intended to return with another group. His stepmother, Ashley Cole, later made a public statement saying the same basic account had been communicated to her. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter also told reporters that investigators understood Nolan had chosen to stay on the island. But Nolan's parents did not accept that explanation. His father, Elmore Wansley, said he did not believe Nolan would voluntarily separate from the group. He explained that Nolan had been taught that if he went somewhere with a group, he should return with that group. And that difference between the family's understanding of Nolan and the account given by people connected to the trip became one of the central unanswered questions surrounding the case. There was another important development during the same period. The boat began experiencing problems. A teen on board contacted a private towing company known as Sea Tow at approximately 4 in the afternoon. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources later released the recording. On the call, the teenager said the group was near the western tip of Horn Island and that the boat's bilge pump had stopped working. He told the dispatcher that the boat was sinking and asked for assistance. The dispatcher asked how much water was coming into the boat. The teenager said they were going down and wanted the boat to be towed back. He provided GPS coordinates. He requested that the vessel be taken toward the Fort Bayou launch. He also told the dispatcher that there were approximately 7 people on board. Then something happened that becomes particularly important when reconstructing the timeline. The Sea Tow captain spoke with the person who owned the boat. According to the released account, the boat owner indicated that help was no longer needed because assistance had already been obtained. The Sea Tow call ended without the company towing the vessel. Sea Tow later confirmed that its involvement ended because the boat owner said help had already been obtained. That call gives us something that many investigations desperately need: a recording made while the event was happening, not a social media interpretation, not a memory recalled weeks later, not an anonymous message. A contemporaneous call documenting that the boat was experiencing a mechanical emergency. But the call does not answer every question. It tells us that the boat was in trouble. It gives us approximate location information. It gives us an approximate time. It tells us what the person on the boat told the dispatcher. It does not independently tell us what happened to Nolan. It does not establish why Nolan remained on the island. And it does not tell us what happened during the period between Nolan's last reported sighting and the vessel's departure. Those questions remain separate. And that is exactly why the timeline matters. At approximately 4:31 p.m., The boat left Horn Island. Nolan was not on that boat when it departed. The GPS record then allows us to follow the vessel. According to the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources data obtained by CBS News, the boat returned toward its original departure dock. At approximately 5:52 p.m., it traveled into Fort Bayou. At approximately 6:06 p.m., it returned to the dock. Later that evening, at approximately 7:19 p.m., the boat went to the Fort Bayou boat launch. From there, according to the GPS report, it traveled over land, apparently being transported by vehicle, toward the residence of the boat's owners. So in less than 8 hours, the GPS record gives us a remarkable amount of information. We know where the boat started. We know when it reached the island. We know when it left. We know where it traveled afterward. We know when it returned toward the mainland. And we know the boat was later moved over land. But GPS still leaves us with one fundamental limitation. It tracks the vessel. It does not automatically tell us what happened to every person who was on that vessel or who was supposed to be on it. A GPS line can tell you where a boat went. It cannot, by itself, tell you what happened inside the boat. It cannot tell you what people were saying. It cannot tell you what happened on shore. And it cannot tell you what happened to Nolan after the last time he was seen. That is where other forms of evidence become important. And this is where the camera question begins. Not because cameras provide a magical answer, but because video can sometimes fill the gaps between other pieces of evidence. Imagine trying to reconstruct a person's final movements using only a map. You can establish where a boat was, but you cannot necessarily establish what happened beside that boat. Now add a photograph, then another, then a phone record, then a witness statement, then a piece of video. Each piece can potentially narrow the unknown portion of the timeline. That is why the Jackson County Sheriff's Office asked members of the public to provide original photographs, videos, and eyewitness accounts connected to Nolan or unusual activity on Horn Island on July 4th. That request is significant because it shows investigators were actively seeking visual and first-hand evidence. It also tells us something else. The public record was incomplete enough that investigators wanted additional material from people who had been there. And that brings us back to the surrounding coastline. Independent researchers have since attempted to reconstruct the route taken by the boat and identify locations along the broader waterways where cameras may have been present. This is where we have to be precise. Seeing a camera does not prove that it recorded Nolan. Seeing a camera does not prove that footage still exists. Seeing a camera does not prove that footage still exists. And seeing a camera does not prove the camera was functioning on July 4th. But identifying a potential source of video can still be useful, because if investigators are trying to reconstruct a timeline, knowing where potential evidence may exist is the first step toward determining whether that evidence is available. The waterways around Ocean Springs contain a mixture of public infrastructure, private property, and businesses. That means there can be different types of cameras operated for completely different reasons. A private homeowner might have a security camera protecting a house or dock. A business might have cameras for security or liability purposes. Public infrastructure may have surveillance or monitoring equipment for safety, traffic, or other operational reasons. The important point is not that all of these systems necessarily captured Nolan. The important point is that the route is not an isolated line across empty water. There are developed areas along portions of the mainland waterways. There are docks. There are homes. There are businesses. There are boat launches. There are bridges. And there are places where people may have been recording. That creates an evidence question. Which systems existed? Which were operational? Which actually covered the relevant areas? Which retained recordings from July 4th? Which recordings were requested? Which were reviewed? And which, if any, were unavailable? Those are very different questions. And answering them requires evidence rather than assumptions. The temptation in a case like this is to jump from "there was a camera" to "the camera captured everything." But surveillance cameras don't work that way. A camera can point in one direction. It can have blind spots. It can record only when motion is detected. It can have limited resolution. It can have storage limitations. It can be aimed at a driveway rather than the water. It can be functioning while still failing to capture a useful image. And in a waterfront environment, distance, weather, glare, darkness, and moving boats can all affect what a recording actually shows. So the real question is not simply how many cameras existed. The real question is whether any of them contain evidence that can help establish Nolan's movements. That is a question investigators can potentially answer, but the public should not answer it for them without the evidence. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." And while you're doing that, like the video and subscribe to Brian Case Records, because we're going to keep this case grounded in what can actually be established, even when the unanswered questions are frustrating. Now, let's return to the timeline. After the boat left without Nolan, the situation did not immediately become a publicly known death investigation. His family would not have known exactly where he was. The boat had returned. Nolan had not, and eventually, concern became a search. During the early morning hours of July 5th, Mississippi Department of Marine Resources records show that authorities communicated about the situation. A Jackson County Sheriff's Office lieutenant reportedly told M. DeGemer that deputies had spoken with several people who had traveled to the island with Nolan. The information provided at that point was that Nolan had remained on the island in the company of an unknown female. Based on what had been reported to deputies, the lieutenant did not believe there was reason at that moment to think there had been a water-related emergency involving Nolan. The possibility was raised that Nolan might have returned on another vessel without his phone. That detail is important because it shows how the investigation was initially being understood. Authorities did not immediately have a confirmed account of Nolan's whereabouts. They had information from people who had been with him. They knew he had not returned on the same boat, and they were trying to determine whether he had left the island by another route. That uncertainty eventually triggered a broader search. Nolan's father went to the island with his son's football coach to search. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources launched a patrol vessel toward the northwestern end of Horn Island, where Nolan had reportedly last been seen. Additional drone searches were attempted. The Coast Guard was asked to assist. A marine information broadcast was issued. Multiple agencies became involved. The search included the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the U.S. Coast Guard, the National Park Service, the Gulf Islands National Seashore, and other local agencies. The United Cajun Navy also became involved. At one point, sonar surveys were conducted in the northwest area of the island, but the results were inconclusive, and weather conditions eventually stopped the operation. The search continued. And while all of that was happening, investigators were trying to narrow down where Nolan might have gone after the boat left. The Garmin GPS on the boat became particularly useful. An MDMR officer was given permission to view the GPS. The officer observed the track lines showing where the boat had been on the northwest end of Horn Island. That information helped authorities focus the search area. Again, notice what the GPS could do. It could show where the boat had been. It could narrow the geography. It could establish movement. But it could not tell investigators exactly where Nolan was. That distinction becomes more important as the case develops, because the search was not simply about finding a boat. The boat had already been found. The question was where Nolan was. And on July 6th, the search finally produced an answer to one question, but not necessarily the answer the family had been hoping for. Just before 8:45 in the morning, authorities received a report that a body had been found near the northwestern end of Horn Island. A National Park Service ranger had discovered the body. The family was brought to the Lake Mars boat launch. The body was later taken to the coroner's office in Pascagoula. The following day, dental records were used to confirm the identity. The body was Nolan Wells. The search for the missing teenager had ended. But the investigation into how he died had only begun. On July 7th, Nolan's family announced that they had retained attorney Ben Crump and his legal team to conduct an independent review of the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death. The same day, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office conducted the official autopsy. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office also appealed to the public for original photographs, videos, and eyewitness accounts related to Nolan or unusual activity on Horn Island on July 4th. That request is worth remembering, because by this point, investigators were not simply looking for someone who knew Nolan. They were asking for evidence from the public. Photographs, videos, eyewitness accounts, anything that could help reconstruct what happened. And that brings us back to the surveillance question. If someone had been standing on a dock that afternoon and recorded a boat, that video could potentially matter. If a camera captured a vessel passing through a specific location, that could potentially help establish timing. If a recording showed Nolan after the time he was believed to have been last seen, that could change the timeline. If a recording showed a different boat arriving or leaving, that could potentially answer another question. But none of those possibilities should be mistaken for facts. The responsible position is simply this: video evidence can matter. The sheriff's office asked the public for video. Independent researchers have identified potential cameras around portions of the broader route, and the public record does not currently provide a complete surveillance reconstruction of Nolan's final hours. That is the question worth investigating. Not who deleted the footage. Not who is hiding the footage. Not what did the cameras definitely see. Those statements go beyond what has been established. The evidence-based question is, what visual evidence exists, and what can it actually tell investigators? That question becomes even more important, because the case has generated an enormous amount of online speculation. One of the most widely discussed pieces of alleged evidence involved a video said to show an argument on Horn Island. The video circulated online with claims that Nolan could be heard demanding his phone. At one point, attorney Ben Crump publicly referenced the recording and said multiple people had identified the voice as Nolan's. But that identification was later challenged. A friend of Nolan's, Trayston Shepard, came forward and said the person yelling in the video was actually him. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office did not publicly confirm that the video showed Nolan involved in an altercation, and that episode demonstrates exactly why this case needs careful evidence handling. A video can be real, while the interpretation attached to it is wrong. A real recording can be uploaded with a false caption. A genuine photograph can be connected to the wrong person. An authentic audio recording can be misunderstood. And once millions of people see an interpretation, correcting it becomes much harder. That is why the footage question should not become another excuse to speculate. If a recording exists, authenticate it. Determine when it was created. Determine where it was created. Determine who appears in it. Determine whether the original file exists. Determine whether the timestamp is reliable. And then determine what the recording actually proves. That process may sound slower than social media. It is. But investigations are not supposed to move at the speed of a comment section. And Nolan's family deserves answers that can survive scrutiny. The same principle applies to another major issue in this case: the cause of Nolan's death. Authorities initially said they suspected Nolan drowned, but suspicion is not the same as a final determination. The family's independent autopsy later reached a different level of uncertainty. The preliminary independent findings announced by attorney Ben Crump stated that Nolan's cause and manner of death were undetermined pending further investigation. The examination was conducted after Nolan's body had already undergone the state examination and after decomposition had progressed. The independent pathologist, Dr. Roger Mitchell, reported no fractures or deep tissue injuries. The report also described an area of red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head and neck that the pathologist said was inconclusive and required further investigation. Importantly, the independent autopsy did not establish that Nolan was murdered. It also did not establish that he drowned. It stated that the cause and manner of death were undetermined. That distinction is essential. because an inconclusive autopsy is not proof of foul play. But it also means the public should be cautious about treating any single theory as settled. The official state autopsy was completed on July 7th. Its results were not immediately made public. Later reporting indicated that the report remained confidential, while the investigation and testing continued, and officials said the case would ultimately proceed through the appropriate legal process. As of this update, the public still does not have the complete official autopsy findings. That leaves an important question hanging over the case. What will the official medical evidence ultimately say? But there is another lesson here. When the official evidence is not yet public, the internet tends to fill the vacuum. And that has happened repeatedly in the Nolan Wells case. Social media users have circulated alleged documents, alleged audio, alleged videos, and theories about relationships between people connected to the case. Some of those claims may sound convincing when presented together, but a collection of unverified claims does not become verified simply because many people repeat them. That is why Bryan Case Records has to draw a line. A documented GPS record is one thing. A public statement from a sheriff is another. A released dispatch recording is another. An authenticated video would be another. An anonymous social media post is something entirely different. And a fabricated document is not evidence at all. That distinction became especially important when a purported Nolan Wells toxicology report circulated online. Mississippi officials later said the document was fake. Authorities warned that the material was misleading and harmful, and suggested that artificial intelligence and social media manipulation were contributing to the spread of false information. That should tell us something about the environment surrounding this case. There is a genuine investigation happening. There are real unanswered questions. There are real documents. There are real recordings. There are real GPS records. And there is also a large amount of information online that cannot be trusted. The challenge is not finding a theory. The challenge is finding evidence. So let's return to the cameras. The phrase, "the cameras were everywhere," is powerful. But the evidence demands a more careful statement. There were cameras in the broader waterfront environment. Independent researchers have documented potential surveillance points around portions of the route. Some were associated with private property. Some were associated with public or commercial infrastructure. But we cannot responsibly say that every camera was functioning. We cannot say that every camera pointed toward the water. We cannot say that every camera pointed toward the water. We cannot say that every camera pointed toward the water. We cannot say that every camera pointed toward the water. And we cannot say that authorities obtained every recording. What we can say is that the existence of potential visual evidence raises a legitimate investigative question. What evidence was available to investigators during the critical period? That question matters because the timeline contains several points that could potentially be clarified by independent evidence. Around 3 p.m., Nolan was reportedly last seen. Around 4 p.m., the boat's occupants contacted Sea Tow. At approximately 4:31 p.m., the boat left Horn Island without Nolan. Later, the boat traveled through the mainland waterways. By the evening, the boat was at the Fort Bayou launch, and Nolan was still missing. If video exists from those locations, it could potentially help establish movement. But again, could potentially is doing important work here. We cannot tell the audience that a camera saw Nolan when nobody has established that. We cannot tell them that a particular recording exists when we have not seen the recording. And we cannot tell them that footage was destroyed when we do not have evidence proving that. The strongest documentary question is therefore not sensational. It is procedural. Was relevant footage identified? Was it preserved? Was it reviewed? And if it was reviewed, what did investigators learn from it? Those are questions that can eventually be answered through records, legal filings, official statements, or released evidence. Until then, the responsible position is to leave them open. There is another reason this matters. Nolan's death is not simply a story about what happened on an island. It is a story about what happened before and after the island. The boat left the mainland. The boat reached Horn Island. Nolan was later seen. The boat experienced mechanical trouble. A distress call was placed. The boat left. Nolan did not. A search began. His body was found. An autopsy was conducted. His family sought an independent investigation, and the case remains under investigation. Every one of those events creates a piece of the timeline. But there are still spaces between those pieces. The purpose of evidence is to close those spaces. That is why GPS matters. That is why phone data matters. That is why photographs matter. That is why eyewitness accounts matter. That is why dispatch recordings matter. And that is why potentially relevant surveillance footage matters. Not because any one piece automatically solves the case, but because a complicated investigation is often solved by combining many ordinary pieces of evidence until they form one coherent sequence. There is another important point about the cameras. Even if a camera recorded the boat, that does not necessarily mean it recorded Nolan. The vessel could be visible without the passengers being identifiable. A person could be too far away. The image could be obstructed. The camera might capture only a few seconds. The recording might not have a reliable timestamp, and even a clear image could require corroboration. That is how responsible evidence analysis works. One piece of information rarely stands alone. The question is whether multiple independent pieces agree. If GPS says a boat was at a certain location at a certain time, and a video independently shows that same boat in that location, the two pieces strengthen one another. If a witness says something happened at a certain time, and a recording confirms the timing, that becomes more useful. If a phone record contradicts a claimed location, investigators have another issue to examine. Evidence becomes powerful when independent sources converge. And that is precisely what is missing from many of the theories circulating online. People sometimes begin with a conclusion and then collect anything that appears to support it. Investigators have to work in the opposite direction. Start with the evidence, then determine what it supports. That difference may be the most important lesson in the Nolan Wells case. Because the public wants an answer. Nolan's family wants an answer. And understandably, people want the unanswered questions to disappear. But an answer that cannot be supported is not an answer. It is another problem. The case also illustrates why eyewitness testimony must be handled carefully. People remember events differently. Stress affects memory. People can misunderstand what they saw, and statements made shortly after an event may differ from statements made later. That does not automatically mean someone is lying. It means investigators have to compare statements with other evidence. That is why the dispute over whether Nolan intended to remain on Horn Island cannot be resolved simply by choosing which person's statement feels more believable. The question is whether there is independent evidence that can establish what Nolan intended. Did he send a message? Did he speak with someone? Did another person see him? Did a photograph or video capture him? Did a boat record show another vessel arriving? Did phone data place him somewhere? Did anyone contact him after the group left? Those are the types of questions that can move an investigation forward, and many of them are exactly the kinds of questions that digital evidence can sometimes help answer. The family has pursued additional information through legal channels, including efforts involving social media and technology records. That tells us the investigation is not limited to the physical island. It extends into Nolan's digital life. And that matters, because modern investigations often involve evidence that never appears in a police photograph. A location record, a deleted message, a timestamp, a photograph stored in the cloud, a login, a GPS coordinate, a digital communication, a camera recording. Each may seem insignificant alone. Together, they can establish sequence. But we should be careful with the word deleted. The fact that a phone may contain missing or deleted material does not automatically establish who deleted it, when it was deleted, why it was deleted, or whether the information can be recovered. Those questions require forensic examination. Again, the theme is evidence, not assumptions. That is the standard this case needs. Because there are real people on every side of this story. There is Nolan's family, who lost a son. There are friends who were with him that day and who have publicly denied wrongdoing. There are investigators trying to determine what happened. There are witnesses. There are attorneys. There are members of the public. And there are online creators who have spent hours trying to reconstruct the timeline. Some independent work has been useful. Some has been mistaken. Some claims have been corrected. And some have crossed the line into accusations that cannot be supported. That is why this story should not be turned into a trial conducted on YouTube. The purpose of a documentary is to examine evidence, not replace the justice system. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a timeline that is clearer in some places than others. We know Nolan traveled to Horn Island on July 4th. We know the boat left the mainland around 9:56 in the morning. We know it reached Horn Island around 11:14. We know Nolan was reportedly last seen around 3 p.m. We know the boat experienced mechanical trouble. We know a sea tow call was made around 4 p.m. We know the boat left the island around 4:31. We know Nolan was not aboard when it left. We know the boat traveled back toward the mainland and later into Fort Bayou. We know Nolan's family reported him missing. We know a large multi-agency search followed. We know his body was found near Horn Island on July 6. We know an official autopsy was conducted. We know the family's independent autopsy later reported the cause and manner of death as undetermined, pending further investigation. We know investigators have sought photographs, videos, and eyewitness information. We know a large amount of unverified information has circulated online. And we know the public does not yet have every piece of evidence involved in the investigation. That last point is where the camera question returns. Potential surveillance is not the answer. It is a potential source of answers, and that distinction matters. If investigators have footage, the question is what it shows. If they do not have footage, the question becomes why it was unavailable. If footage was never relevant because cameras did not cover the necessary locations, that should also be established. If recordings existed, but had already been overwritten before investigators could obtain them, that should be documented rather than assumed. And if footage ultimately becomes public, it should be examined alongside GPS, witness accounts, phone records, and other evidence. That is how a timeline becomes reliable, not through one dramatic clip, through convergence. The most important unanswered period in this case remains the time between Nolan's last reported sighting and the boat's departure. That period is not proof of wrongdoing, but it is an important part of the chronology. And the more accurately that period can be reconstructed, the closer investigators may come to understanding what happened. There is also the question of what happened after Nolan was left behind. Did he remain on the island? Did he attempt to leave? Did he board another vessel? Did anyone see him after approximately 3 p.m.? Did he enter the water voluntarily? Was he in distress? Was he injured before entering the water? Was he conscious? Could the available evidence answer any of those questions? The public does not yet have definitive answers, and the independent autopsy did not provide them. The official findings have not provided them publicly either. That is why the next pieces of verified evidence matter so much. A single authenticated video could establish a time. A phone record could establish a location. A witness could provide a missing event. A forensic result could answer a medical question. A GPS record could eliminate one possibility. A piece of surveillance footage could corroborate another. The investigation does not need one miraculous piece of evidence. It needs enough reliable evidence to reconstruct the sequence. And that is what makes the title of this investigation so important. The question is not simply whether there were cameras. The question is whether the cameras, photographs, phones, GPS systems, and other digital records can help explain what happened during Nolan Wells's final hours. Because somewhere inside that timeline is the answer to one of the most important questions in this case. How did an 18-year-old who went to Horn Island for a 4th of July celebration end up dead in the water 2 days later? Right now, the public does not have a complete answer, and until investigators release or establish more of the evidence, anyone who claims to know exactly what happened is going beyond what has been proven. That includes us. At Bryan Case Records, the goal is not to tell you what you want to hear. It is to follow what can be established. If new evidence changes the timeline changes. If a viral claim is disproven, it should be discarded. If an official finding contradicts an earlier assumption, the finding takes priority. And if a question remains unanswered, we should be willing to say that it remains unanswered. Because Nolan's story deserves more than a theory. It deserves an accurate record. The coming evidence may eventually tell investigators whether the critical moments on July 4th were captured by someone nearby. It may establish that certain cameras were irrelevant. It may confirm portions of the existing timeline. It may challenge other portions. It may reveal something nobody expected. Or it may simply eliminate possibilities one by one. That is what evidence is supposed to do. And for now, the surveillance question remains exactly that. A question. There are documented GPS movements. There is a documented emergency call. There are witness accounts. There are search records. There are official requests for photographs and videos. There are independent efforts to reconstruct the route. There are legal efforts to obtain additional digital information. There is an independent autopsy whose findings remain undetermined. And there is an official investigation whose final conclusions have not yet been publicly released. Those facts are enough to justify continued attention. They are not enough to justify accusing anyone of a crime. That line matters, because every person mentioned in this case is entitled to the same basic principle Nolan deserves: facts before conclusions, evidence before accusation, and truth before virality. Nolan went to Horn Island on July 4th, expecting to spend a holiday with people he knew. By the end of the day, he was no longer with the group that had traveled there with him. By July 6th, he was dead. His family was left trying to understand how an ordinary holiday became a tragedy, and investigators were left with a timeline that contained both known events and unanswered spaces. Those spaces are where the investigation has to continue, not with rumors, not with fabricated documents, not with anonymous accusations, with evidence. The GPS record gives us the movement of the boat. The sea tow call gives us a contemporaneous account of a mechanical emergency. The search records show how authorities responded once Nolan was reported missing. The autopsy findings show that the cause and manner of death have not been publicly resolved. The public requests for photographs and video show that investigators have sought additional first-hand evidence. And the potential surveillance around the broader waterways raises one reasonable question. What visual evidence, if any, can still help fill the gaps? That question may eventually be answered, but until it is, we should resist the temptation to answer it ourselves. Because there is a profound difference between saying, "There were cameras nearby," and saying, "Those cameras recorded Nolan." There is a difference between saying, "There is a gap in the timeline," and saying, "Something criminal happened during that gap." There is a difference between saying, "The cause of death is undetermined," and saying, "Nolan was murdered." The first statements can be supported by the public record. The second statements require evidence that has not been established. And that is where this case stands. Not solved, not explained, not proven to be foul play, not proven to be an accident. An 18-year-old is dead. The official investigation remains ongoing, and some of the most important questions surrounding his final hours remain unanswered. So when you hear someone online say they already know exactly what happened to Nolan Wells, remember the timeline, remember the GPS, remember the sea tow call, remember the search, remember the body recovered from the water. Remember the independent autopsy that could not determine the cause or manner of death. And remember that the absence of a public answer is not permission to invent one. The truth, when it comes, should be strong enough to survive scrutiny. And until that truth is established, the most responsible thing we can do is keep asking the right questions. What happened between Nolan's last confirmed sighting and the boat's departure? What evidence can establish where he went afterward? What digital records still exist? What photographs and videos were collected? What can the GPS prove? What can it not prove? What will the official autopsy ultimately establish? And what, if anything, can surveillance footage add to the timeline? Those are the questions that matter, and those are the questions we will continue following here. If you want more evidence-based coverage of the Nolan Wells investigation, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Brian Case Records. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update, because this story is still developing, and the next verified piece of evidence could change our understanding of the timeline. For now, one fact remains impossible to ignore. Nolan Wells went to Horn Island for the 4th of July. He never returned home. And somewhere between the last moment he was seen and the moment his body was recovered, there is a sequence of events that investigators are still trying to reconstruct. The cameras may eventually become part of that reconstruction. The GPS already is. The recordings already are. The witness accounts already are. And the unanswered questions remain. Until those questions are resolved with evidence, this case should be approached with patience, precision, and respect for the people whose lives have been permanently changed by Nolan's death. Because the goal isn't simply to find a story. The goal is to find the truth.